Everybody okay?
Before we get started with the programming, I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Dr. Ben Roparkle, who is head of the Florida Historical Society. He's going to tell you how important it is to become a member if you aren't already. Dr. Roparkle?
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'll just take a minute of your time. This is our the statewide headquarters for the Florida Historical Society. This is our Library of Florida History. It's where we have our extensive archive. We have thousands of rare and out-of-print books, maps dating back to the 1500s, genealogical information, photographs, postcards, all sorts of great resources here at our archive. We have the Florida Historical Society Press, which publishes about 10 books a year, both nonfiction and fiction. In fact, we publish a couple of books by Dr. Wentz, one on Windover, Life and Death of Windover, and another called Chasing Bones. We have some other exciting titles coming up. One of our most recent books is The Voyages of Ponce de Leon, Scholarly Perspectives, just in time for this anniversary year, the 500th anniversary of the naming of our state. We also manage the historic Rossiter House Museum down in O'Galley. We are the proud hosts of the Florida Public Archaeology Network East Central Region. We do educational outreach all over the state in a wide variety of ways, one of which is our weekly radio magazine, Florida Frontiers, which airs here locally on 90.7 WMFE Thursday evenings at 6:30 and again Sunday afternoons at 4. But we're always out and about giving talks and going to schools. Our educational resources coordinator, Ben DiBiase, many of you know, he's standing up there in the back. He is our primary liaison with teachers and students. So we do all sorts of great outreach. We are the statewide historical society, but we're not supported by the state. We are dependent on membership support to keep all of this great work going. So we'd love to have you become a member if you haven't become one yet. And if you are a member, thank you very much. We appreciate it. We couldn't do it without you. If you want to become a member today, you'll get this lovely tote bag here, along with a book that basically pays for your membership. It's a $40 value. It's a History of Florida, the classic Tabot Marina book. As a member of the Florida Historical Society, you will also get this wonderful journal. It's our Florida Historical Quarterly, which you'll get 4 times a year, which has outstanding articles about cutting-edge research on Florida history and culture, really fascinating articles. You'll also get our newsletter, the Society Report. You'll be the first to find out about great events like our upcoming cruise for our annual meeting and symposium. We'll be happy to tell you all about that if you haven't heard about it. You'll hear about things like April 2nd coming up is the actual anniversary of the naming of our state. Ponce de Leon in 1513 on April 2nd, that's when he sighted this coast and named this land La Florida. We're going to have a special event here that night. We're going to have Jim Cusick, who's co-editor of the book that I mentioned, The Voyages of Ponce de Leon. And we're also going to show our original courtroom drama that we did the first 2 weekends of the year, Ponce de Leon Landing Here. So if you didn't have a chance to go down to Palm Beach or up to DeLand to see this courtroom drama, please come on April 2nd. We're projecting it right on the wall up there. It'll be a lot of fun. It's also educational, and you'll see some familiar faces in this room in that production as well. But please join us for that on April 2nd to commemorate the naming of our state. But again, we can't do any of these things without membership support. So if you're not a member of the Florida Historical Society, please do become one today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ben. All right, this is our third installment in our Spring in the Dirt lecture series. If you don't have a schedule, we have some on the back table, so please pick one up, because we have one more lecture in the series on April 19th. I hear it's going to be really spectacular. I'm giving that one. I'm the best. No, it's going to be very hard to top this one, because if anyone is familiar with Dr. Kenneth Sassaman, you know he's one of the most prolific archaeologists in the state of Florida. He got his BA in anthropology from the University of Maryland, his MA in public service archaeology, which is very unusual, from
South Carolina.
Thank you, because I forgot. And he received his PhD from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He has numerous awards and special appointments and more books and monographs that I could count from your CV. So without further ado, I'm pleased to present Ken Sassaman again. This is his second time coming and giving us an In the Dirt lecture series, so we're very honored to have him here. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Sassaman.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Rachel. Thank Thanks, everyone. It's nice to be back in Cocoa. I was here, as Dr. Wentz said, last year, and I was discussing then the work we're doing on the northern Gulf Coast between Cedar Key and Horseshoe Beach. That work is ongoing. In fact, I was just there this past weekend doing a salvage operation. A lot of that archaeological record is washing into the Gulf as sea level comes up, storm surge and tidal erosion is destroying it rapidly. But I've actually spent most of my time in Florida since I arrived in 1998 working on the St. Johns River, particularly in the middle part of the river. And this has been largely an enterprise for training archaeological students. So this is my field schools that I run every summer. We've done 11 of them now. For 5-6 years, we worked on Hontoon Island and Blue Springs State Parks near DeLand. And for the past 6 years, we've been working off the southwest corner of Lake George on private land that fronts Silver-Glen-Run in Silver Glen Springs. So I want to tell you about that work, summarize it. It's been about 6 years now we've been working there. And starting with this illustration up here from C.B. Moore's expeditions in the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, he investigated a lot of shell mounds, as did other antiquarians and natural scientists. And there was this ongoing debate in the late 19th century as to whether or not these were even human. They were regarded as being deposits that possibly were just remnants of the time when the oceans were up over the peninsula, way, way back before humans arrived, of course. And then there were others that argued that, in fact, these were the products of humans, of Indians, the byproduct of their meals, the inedible parts of shellfish that they ate, along with the animal bones and their artifacts and so forth. So there's quite a few of them. When these guys were running around the 19th century, no doubt hundreds of them. Very few are still intact today. But the debate still rages about these things because here in 2013, everyone accepts them for being human, but there's still a widespread belief that they're nothing more than trash heaps. And when you look at ones like this at the mouth of Silver Glen Run, it's pretty self-evident to anyone, even if you're not trained in archaeology, that that's probably not a random trash heap. It's a U-shaped monument, big enough to hold a football field, generally the size of a collegiate football stadium. And that was something that Jeffries Wyman from Harvard University saw in 1872. It's gone now. Most of it's gone. We've been trying to work on the remnants of that for the past few years. But when you see something like this, it's pretty clear that there's more to it than just getting rid of one's garbage. There's something else going on here. And we do know now that they didn't know back in the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, that these go back as early as 7,000 years ago. The one you're looking at here, which I'll talk about later, dates to about 4,000 years ago. And the other thing, of course, about these is that when you open them up and you look inside them, they are consistently structured in a way that is indicative, reflects the history of occupation. So they have layers like a Middle Eastern tell of successive house floors where houses were built on surfaces, where refuse and other debris accumulated, but also where they deliberately loaded shell or earth, or sometimes both, in order to build these platforms up, sometimes for the living, sometimes for the deceased. So these things were used as cemeteries as well as platforms for houses and so forth. And then in some cases, we're just completely perplexed. We're looking at archaeological sequences like this that do not contain the refuse of everyday living. They do not contain the bodies of the deceased. And we think that they were built expressly for monumental purposes, commemorative purposes, the sort of thing that we do when we commemorate an historic event, a historic person, and so forth. So again, it's largely an archaeological enterprise involving field schools. So we have University of Florida students, occasionally students from other universities participate in this every year. We'll be back there again this summer in July and August. Here we go. Now our geographic reach here, as I say, is the middle St. Johns River Valley. There's where it turns back to the east and up to Jacksonville, just north of Lake George. And here's where it turns to the west around Lake Monroe. This is a stretch of the river, the middle part of the river, that's known as the offset. It originally ran before humans were here along this course right here. So it would have been more of a straight channel going from the headwaters down to its mouth at Jacksonville. Of course, it's unusual that it flows to the north. Not completely unusual in North America, but fairly rare. And the physiography of this is remarkable because it's a really low gradient river. From headwaters to the mouth, it's only a couple tens of feet. It's subject to flooding very quickly from just precipitation. Certainly it's subject to back flooding. Whenever there's a storm that enters the mouth of the river, it pushes water back. There's actually tidal influence as far south as Lake George. There's blue crabs that run around in there. Occasionally a bull shark makes its way up into the lake. So it's a very unusual freshwater system in its interface with the saltwater, and it's very, very sensitive to changes in groundwater. So over the course of time, this has become better wetted as the climate's got wetter since the Ice Age. And at times, of course, when we have a lot of rain, it's very, very badly flooded. In places like Pontoon Island where we worked, you can easily be flooded out of there. In fact, they were closed down after the hurricanes in 2004. They were closed for months because there was no access to the campsites and so forth. So all these dots represent known archaeological sites along this stretch of the river that contain shell, with a few exceptions, like, for instance, Windover's on here somewhere. There it is right there near Titusville. That's not a shell-bearing site, but I'll bring it up later with regard to the mortuary practices of these Indians. But most of these are, in fact, shell-bearing sites, and they include things like this, these ridges about the size of a football field. They're about 15, 18 feet tall, about 100, 150 feet long, 50 feet wide. You can fit them inside of a nice football field. And then these much larger monstrosities, which are 3 to 4 times that size, big enough as the one that I showed you in the previous slide, to have a football field in the middle, and you can put bleachers on either side here and have a nice game go on these things. So some of these actually go up to 30, 35 feet in height. Nothing as big as Turtle Mound. You all probably know Turtle Mound pretty well. And Turtle Mound's much later in time, but these things in their own right are quite sizable. And there were many, many of them up and down the river before the earlier part of the last century when they were targeted for mining operations. Much of the shell was taken out for road construction. It was used for fertilizer. It was used for other construction projects. So most of these things were, in fact, leveled a long time ago. There's not much left of them today. Very few of them that are fully intact. Now, to put you into the context of time and archaeological cultures, the collection of shellfish and the discard of shell into piles goes back at least 7,000 years ago, probably older than that. Many of the earlier sites are now underwater, whether we're talking about off-coast or in the swamps, lagoons, and the river, because water levels have come up a lot since the Ice Age. I'll show you in a minute a map that measures that. But the two cultures that are the ones that are responsible for most of the shell deposits in Middle St. John's are the Mount Taylor culture of roughly about 6,200 to about 4,200, 2,000 years of radiocarbon time. In real time, that's a little bit longer. It's more like 24 to 2,500 years of time, from about 7,000 to about 4,500. And then this period known as the Orange Period, which is the inception of pottery, starting about 4,500 real years ago or about 4,200 radiocarbon years ago. And these are the folks that were responsible for most of these shell constructions, these shell deposits. The Mount Taylor period we can divide into two, Mount Taylor 1 and Mount Taylor 2. Mount Taylor 1's the beginning, going as back as early as 7,000 years ago, known to us archaeologically by the manufacture and use of tapered stem bifacial tools, spear points, knives, things like that. But they also used marine shell for woodworking tools, for scraping tools, and they would use buzikan, the whelk, knock out the whorl and take that shell that's left and use it as a cooking vessel. So often they're burned at the bottom. They sometimes have attrition from a lot of heat and so forth. This one is actually a woodworking tool. A hole's knocked out there so a handle could be put in, and the end of this thing's been modified into a bevel so it can be used as a chopping tool or an adze, probably for making watercraft, things like that. These guys are the ones responsible for the oldest shell deposits in the region. They tend to be linear. They tend to be about 100 meters long, or about the size of a football field again, and about maybe 15 to 18 feet high at the apex here. So it has a high point here, and it kind of trails off like an apostrophe or a comma, right? And they always front water. No surprise there. They're made up of shellfish, so they're coming out of fresh water. And often they're on land that has now been abandoned by water, so they front swamps, wetlands, sometimes just dried up wetlands that no longer are seasonally wet. So it's showing a time when the environment was substantially different 7,000 years ago. Now, starting at about 5,500 years ago or 5,000 radiocarbon years ago, we get the influx of artifacts from far away. And it's showing us that there's at least a cultural change, if not also an environmental change. And the two things illustrated here are we get celts made out of Strombus gigas, out of conch, that's coming from South Florida, possibly even the Caribbean. And we get ground stone and polished stone, like these two items here, which we call banner stones, also known as atlatl weights for spear throwers. And those are made out of green stone and soapstone that's coming out of the southern Appalachians or the Piedmont of Georgia or Alabama. So these are items that are coming from the north and coming from the south. We also get beads that come from Mississippi at this time, little tubular beads made out of hematite. So that's pretty far away as well. All this is occurring at the same time that we get an innovation in mounding, and we have the first earthen mounds in Florida. They date back to 5,500 years ago. They tend to be conical. They're round in plan. They have a symmetrical conical shape when you look at them in profile. And they're not very high. The highest ones are maybe 3 or 4 meters, so maybe about 12, 15 feet, something like that. These are the ones at Tomoka. Many of you have probably been to Tomoka State Park. They're not accessible to your average visitor there, but there's a series of them there, and they have shell as well as earth in them, and they definitely have these objects that are coming from faraway places, as well as occasionally human burials in them. So the other ones that we know about pretty well do in fact have humans, interments, and they tend to be accompanied by these foreign objects. So something's going on different there politically and socially. The environment's certainly changing as well, but not as drastically or as dramatically as it did in previous millennia. Then we get to this big watershed moment, the innovation of pottery. It comes in about 4,500 years ago in South Carolina and Georgia, slightly later in Florida. But when it comes to Florida, it hits the ground running, and it has a lot of diversity. There's a lot of elaboration. Typically, it's plain, but we also have a lot of decorated pottery. I think you can see the incisions on there. There's ones that parallel the rim. There's ones that are oblique. There's another variety that has concentric circles and little punctations on it. Very elaborate stuff. It's very nice. It typically is made with a combination of clay and Spanish moss, so we call it fiber-tempered pottery. And when they fired it, the fiber burns out, leaves a very porous and light-bodied ceramic. So you pick these things up, and it's kind of shocking how light they can be sometimes. And then you scratch your head wondering, how in the world did they ever hold water in these things? They're so porous. No doubt they line the inside whenever they wanted to cook with them using liquids. They would line the inside with pitch or some sort of impervious material that prevent it from being so porous. These guys are the ones that are responsible for the biggest shellworks in the region, that big U-shaped one I showed in the first slide, which is part of our field school site. And on a scalar level, they're much larger than anything before, but they're far less numerous. So there's fewer of them. They just happen to be a lot bigger. And I'll get to the punchline later, but I think at this moment what we're seeing here in the change from these to this, as well as the introduction of pottery, is that we're looking at a moment at about 4,500 years ago where there's an influx of people from elsewhere, probably from the coast. We're not sure if it's the Atlantic coast, the Gulf Coast, or both, or whether or not they're actually coming straight down from Georgia and South Carolina where this early pottery is found as well. The coast has these things known as shell rings, and it may be the inspiration for the construction of these parallel ridges that are conjoined by this other one. So you end up getting a semi-circular arrangement, a little bit more like an amphitheater, perhaps, than some of the shell rings on the coast. So we'll come back to that at the end. I want to start with this earlier stuff here. Now, water is the critical factor in all this. As you know, Florida is a well-watered environment. It's hard to spit without hitting standing water in parts of Florida. Lots of lakes, lots of lagoons, lots of ponds, lots of streams, and of course a lot of springs. And the springs are really fascinating. Florida has at least 33 what they call first magnitude springs. These are springs that today emit at least 100 cubic feet of water per second. So they pump a lot of water. I was reading last night to refresh my memory. There's more water that's emitted from the collective first magnitude springs in Florida every day than is consumed by the entire population of Florida. So there is a lot of water that comes out. It's coming out of this limestone substrate. Of course, Florida is sitting on a big limestone platform that has a lot of holes in it, like Swiss cheese, right? And that's because it dissolves chemically through time. And the water, of course, that's down there, the fresh water that's down there, can come to the surface whenever it has an opportunity. So these are vents, obviously, where it's shooting up through pressure, artesian flow, and we get these wonderful springs that have this crystal clear water that emanates out into these runs, and humans have been attracted to these ever since they came online. They haven't been here always. Like the Everglades, they've only been around for about the last 7,000 years. But once they came online, once they became available, people gravitated towards them, and they took advantage of the opportunity not only for the foods that were available, but for the idyllic living that's provided by this sort of feature on the landscape. You know, Majorie Keenan Rawlings' book, The Yearling, was it 1938? Is that right? Something like that. Was set on in land in northeast Florida in the St. Johns River Valley around one of these springs. And one of the opening scenes is the young protagonist who basically is laying by the side of one of these springs, enjoying the idyllic moment. He falls asleep, if you remember the film or the book, and there's bunny rabbits and raccoons and deer and stuff coming by. So you get the impression in the very first scene of this movie and the very first part of this book that this is a wilderness, pristine environment of unprecedented beauty and grace, right? And so when MGM wanted to make a movie out of this before the war, they came to Silver Glen Run, and they came to Salt Spring just north of it, and they took all these photos for production purposes. They wanted to get the scenery, figure out what they had to do to make it work and so forth. World War II intervened. They were unable to make the film initially. They came back after the war, and I think it was, what was it, out in 46 or 47, something like that. But in any event, they actually went to, this is actually Salt Spring, north of Silver Glen Spring, but they went to a lot of these places and filmed that. So the impression that we get as Floridians, we know that these are like incredibly important natural resources to us. We pride ourselves in not having developed them substantially. Places like Silver Spring, of course, are a little bit of a problem. The state just took it back. It's been overdeveloped and poorly managed. But I think that we have a broad sense as a citizenry that springs are something that we have to preserve and keep intact because they are really important to our hydrology, our local environments, and so forth. So we get this idea that they've always been pristine, they've always been quiet, and they've always been wildernesses. Not really the case at all going back 7,000 years ago. At 4,000 years ago, after 3,000 years of laying down shell, this is what the landscape of Silver Glen Run looked like. So we have here several major shellworks. Of course, the big one I've been talking about since the beginning is right here at the mouth of the run, fronting Lake George. By the way, we're right there up on Lake George. Here's the spring boil. That's that photograph I showed you a couple slides back. And of course, it emanates and comes out here and flows to the lake. And along the way, there's another massive deposit of shell plus burials around the spring boil. There's two linear ones that date back about 6,000 years ago on either side of the run. This big thing here, as well as these lesser ones along the terrace edge overlooking the run, and then a couple of little earthen mounds. I'll come to those at the very end that date much later. So at 4,000 years ago, not counting this guy right here, at 4,000 years ago, this is New York City. This is a metropolis. This is a major center of population. It's a major center of interaction, people coming and going, a lot of activity, a lot of ritual activity, a lot of just intensive living as well. So it's sort of the opposite of the way we see the springs today. These were major centers of activity rather than the hinterlands or the wilderness. This was the domesticated space. This was the developed land, and these would have been really impressive at the time. They've been gone for a long time, but we're able to reconstruct them with archaeology. The primary constituent in these shell deposits is Viviparous georgianus, the lowly banded mystery snail. Now, you can't go down to the seafood restaurant and get a plate of these with garlic and butter, although they're perfectly edible. People, ate them for thousands of years. We just don't eat them as modern people. You certainly can eat them. I don't think you'll find much enjoyment in them. My students have captured them. They've collected them. They've steamed them. And if you steam them with, just using regular heat, they coagulate into a tiny little, pea-sized hard piece of protein that takes a lot of chewing, right? I think that if you really want, if you want to make these things palatable, you need to get them out alive, put them into a low heat saute pan with a lot of butter and garlic and olive oil, and then maybe throw in some vegetables or something, I don't know. The reason I'm telling you this is because these things are there literally by the trillions in these things. I mean, they're just untold quantities of these things, right? So it's always been assumed that this was a main food source for these people, that it was a staple. This is what they lived off of. You probably could. There's plenty of protein. There's some fats. There's certainly other nutrients, vitamins, and minerals you can get out of these. This isn't sufficient for any people to have healthy metabolism and a healthy biological store, but certainly it could have been a food that they ate. But here's the rub. We don't really know that they ate them. We don't know that they ate them because we don't have direct evidence for that. It's all just indirect evidence. There's a pile of this stuff there. We assume that they ate it. Now, what we know about these guys is that they can be captured in large quantity pretty easily. They can be eaten and consumed and thrown away, the shell, to create these things. Or they could have been collected as death assemblages. Now, what I mean by that, we know from scientific study of these guys that occasionally they go through these peaks of growth where they're overpopulated in an area, and then they die off in dramatic fashion altogether, most of them at least, at once. And when they die in the water, they become gaseous. Sounds terrible. But they float to the surface, and when they float to the surface and you get a prevailing wind that pushes to the shore, they end up as windrows along the shoreline. Lake Marion in South Carolina was documented back in the 1990s to have one that went on for over a mile and was a couple feet high. Would have been enough shell right there from that death assemblage to make that large monument. You could have collected it in baskets and just piled it up there. So this is a hypothesis. We don't know the answer to this, but I have graduate students working on this. Were these shell mounds in fact built from shell that was collected from dead snails as opposed to collecting them live and eating them? The other way we can get at that is look at the human tissue for evidence of the biochemistry of consuming these things, but we don't have access to a lot of skeletal material. The politics of working with skeletal material are difficult. We certainly honor Native American sensibilities about this. We don't just indiscriminately sample human tissue because we want to know if they ate snails or not. But it is a problem that hasn't been resolved yet. We'll have to figure that out in the future. My sense is that we're overestimating the amount of the snails that was eaten, and in fact they're collecting these things as death assemblages quite often. Now the water wasn't always there. I think last time I was here I may have showed this slide, but when humans arrived, the coast of Florida ran about like this. So Florida was twice as broad as it is today. If you live at Tampa today, you'd only be halfway to the coast. You'd be living into the interior of the peninsula, and water levels were down about 100 feet or more. At the maximum, they were down almost 300 feet or 100 meters. And they gradually came up, but it didn't come up in a continuous, even fashion, and that's what this graph shows. For the first millennium, it came up really fast. So if you entered Florida as a Paleo-Indian 14,000 years ago, and you were living here as a 3-year-old child, and you left, and you came back as a 30-year-old adult, your home would be underwater. That would have been common for everyone for about 1,000 years. The rate of change was so rapid that over the course of your lifetime, you would have seen your childhood coastal home become flooded. Not an unusual thing. We might think of that as being devastating. Of course, that was commonplace. That was expected. That was just the normal course of things. For the next several thousand years, until about 5,000 years ago or so, the rate of change was moderate, not even. That's why this graph here shows it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. But the rate of change was more moderate, but still noticeable in a lifetime. So from the time you were a young child to the time you were an old adult, you would have noticed the change in the water levels. Then starting about 5,000 years ago, it leveled off to the point where change may have become imperceivable. And this is where we are today. We're living now at a time of many thousands of years where the rate of sea level rise from post-glacial warming has leveled off to the point where we really don't notice it. However, scientists are telling us that the rate of change has accelerated, and the projections for the next 100 to 200 years look like this, right? So all the red here is what's going to happen if we have 5 meters of sea level rise over the next century. It's going to take the full collapse of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, plus the release of all the greenhouse gases in permafrost, which actually were there before Industrial Revolution. It's all natural stuff, but it's part of what contributes to global warming. And this is what it'll look like if that happens. So you guys are about right here. It looks like if you have property here, you're going to be on an island in about 100 years. It's okay. In fact, it'll be a big resort island. It'll be like the Caribbean. It'll be the Caribbean of Florida. Cruise ships will be pulling up. Oh, no, not that, right? Probably out of rescue, right? In any event, these are just projections, right? I'm not showing you this to say this is the way it's going to be. I'm showing you this to tell you about how these Native American peoples living through these changes, what sort of rate of change they experience. They could see this sort of change occur over the course of several generations, right? And that's the point here. So a lot of what I'm showing you today, I think, is in response to a world that they were living in that was changing so rapidly that they were constantly confronting their reality. What's coming next? What can we expect? What do we believe? What are the gods up to? The gods must be crazy, right? So I think that a lot of the stuff that we see here today is a reflection of the fact that these people were living in really dynamic times. Now, before the water comes up, and Dr. Wentz knows all about this, she wrote a book about this, and Glenn Doran's the architect of most of the work there at FSU. There was a tradition of burying the dead in ponds. And this went on for a couple of millennia. The ones from Wendover, the most famous one near Titusville, 168 individuals. Most of them date between about 8,100 and 7,900 years ago. So this is before sea levels come up close to the modern range. And these individuals were put in standing water in ponds at a time when Florida had very little surface water. Water was at a premium. Dry land was everywhere. Over the next couple thousand years, that's going to flip. We're going to go to a world where water's everywhere and dry land's at a premium. So Florida underwent this major transformation, and over the course of that change environmentally, we see the abandonment of the pond burials and the establishment of these shell mounds. They start kicking in about 7,000 years ago, roughly about the same time that the pond burials were on the wane. Some of these are, in fact, mortuary mounds. They're putting their dead now above ground rather than into the water. But they're also habitation sites and these other sorts of monuments. So this is the one I showed you at the beginning. This is at the north end of Pontoon Island right here. And this was a photograph in the turn of the last century's report by C.B. Moore. He didn't actually get to work here. The landowner wouldn't let him dig, but he dug right across the channel at the Thursby Mound. Took a little skiff over to take this photograph with his crew. So it gives you an idea the size of these things. This is one of the larger ones. Goes up about 20 feet or so, right there along the bank. What I'm going to show you today is the work we've done at Silver Glen, as I've already introduced, and this is a blow-up of the area. There's, of course, Lake George. Silver Glen Run's a relatively short run. It's only about a kilometer, a little bit more than a kilometer. Salt Spring's a much longer run. I'm not going to talk about this today, but we did work there as well. It has a much longer run that goes into the lake. And our work there, again, has been primarily focused on these shell deposits, although it does include other things like doing environmental reconstruction work, working on one of the village sites in Slate period. I'll mention that near the end there. And again, here we are at this reconstructed landscape. My former grad student and now a professor at the University of Oklahoma, Asa Randall, he gets the credit for reconstructing this using all sorts of sources, historic photographs, historic descriptions, and then he uses LIDAR, which is this remotely sensed data that's collected from planes about the topography. And he's come up with this really nice reconstruction of what this looked like before the shell mining operation. Well, here's what it looks like today. I'm going to just overlay this on top of it. And you're going to see this disappear. You're going to see this disappear, and most of this disappear. So in 1923, there was a massive operation to remove most of the shell, virtually all of it, for $17,000. That's what they got for it, which was a lot of money back then. It was a lot of shell. Many barges loaded with drag lines and steam shovels and so forth. This is property of the Juniper Club. It's a private club that's based in Louisville, Kentucky. This is their infrastructure. They have a big hunting lodge, boat sheds, all sorts of other infrastructure there. And they're very generous. They give us access to the land to do archaeology there, and they let us stay in the hunting lodge when they're not there because it's not air conditioned. They're not there in July and August. They don't mind UF students, using their facilities when it's really hot. They're back up in Louisville. They do come down here pretty much on a regular basis, just about every month, and do a lot of fishing. There used to be a hunting club, but mostly it's fishing these days. This is land of the Forest Service. And the Forest Service has also been very generous, giving us access to land. We've actually done some contract work for them to help them do some clearance of repairs to the infrastructure there as well. So we've had a pretty good opportunity to do archaeology around this entire spring run, around the boil, both sides of it. And I'm going to concentrate on these ones that we've done the most work on, starting right here with what's known as Locust A. Locust A is the remnant of one of those linear ridges that dates back about 6,000, a little bit more than 6,000 years ago. And it was pretty much mined away, but they left an escarpment along this margin fronting the run, and they left little remnants along the southeast margin of it. So you can see the ghostly image. Can you guys see the ghostly image of this thing? And when you walk out there, you can tell, it's been mined. There you can see where the shovels have come in, the drag lines have come in and dragged it out. But there's these escarpments that are scattered all around, and you can kind of follow the margin of this thing pretty easily. So there they are there. There's the remnants there. Here's some remnants here, remnant there, a couple little remnants in here. You can follow this thing. It's about, it's bigger than a football field. It's about 200 meters long, so almost the length of 2 football fields. Not much wider than one, but almost the length of 2 football fields. We've excavated here, here, and here, and then this past year, I don't have it on here, but we did a larger excavation right in here. Our goal has always been to find out what's left. Very simple question. What's left after all that mining? Some of my predecessors have written off these sites because they thought that they were completely destroyed. But the deal is, the mining operators, they come in and they have, just like anybody else that's looking at an economic problem, they have a point of diminishing returns. When they don't get enough shell to warrant their continued excavation, they stop digging. So what these mounds show, and I'll show you some pictures here in a minute, is that the shell tends to be concentrated in certain areas and not others. And when you get down really deep, it actually gives way to earth. There's still archaeology there, but they stop mining. So in other words, the basements of these things are still intact. The very beginnings of these things haven't been badly damaged. So this is what it looks like. Here's one of those escarpments. It's not very tall, maybe about 6 feet tall, maybe 8. The students are standing up on the side slope of this thing. You get a better perspective of it here. Looking at it this way, this is the runs over here. There's some wetlands in here. And this is an intact slope, which would have been essentially the northwestern margin of this thing fronting the water. This would have gone up a little bit higher and then continued over to here and then gone back down. So all this has been dug out, and this is a remnant of it. It's like leaving the little sidewall of digging out a big mining pit. And you're looking at it here from the other angle. And the students, basically what we do is we do what we call profile facing. They just simply go in and they cut into the wall of the mining pit to get a profile so that we can see all the layers. And our job basically then is to open those layers up so that we can map them, date them, get samples out of them, and interpret the changes over time. Every one of these things, even though they're badly disturbed, every one of these things is essentially like a history book where we can peel back the pages and get all the evidence that we want of what's going on there. These things are dominated by tools of the period, of the Mount Taylor period, these tapered stem points. It doesn't have a lot of material culture, which is actually, sounds like a bad thing. An archaeologist isn't finding much. We're not after objects. Objects are important for a lot of questions, but these are, we can find these things in fields and we can pick them up all over the place. Having them in context is good, right? But it's not the be-all and end-all. I'm not after these spear points. And because there aren't that many, people aren't really interested in looting these sites. Of course, it's private land. Across the way is federal land. It's totally illegal to do anything like that. But it's not about the objects. It's about this. It's about the layers. It's about the stratigraphy. So we spend a lot of time excavating into these profiles, mapping these layers, sampling these layers, and then, of course, interpreting what we see. And when we do that, what we get at this site is a pretty incredible reconstruction. Now, we've done excavations there, there, and there, and that's what you're looking at is the profiles of this one to the southwest, this one in the middle, and this one to the northeast. They all have the same features spread out over 2 football fields. So it's telling us, and they have the same radiocarbon dates, starting at about a little bit more than 6,000 years ago at the bottom. So it's telling us that the scale of this thing, the way we see it today, 2 football fields, was constructed simultaneously. It wasn't something that was done over a long period of time in serial fashion, like a house that moved to the south, moved to the south, moved to the south, but it all happened simultaneously, so it must have been a fairly large community, maybe a few hundred people all together. There's the original ground surface, and then on top of that, we have what's typical midden. Lots of bone, lots of ash. We get paleofeces, direct evidence of human activity coming right from their bodies. We get ash pits. We get evidence of post holes evidence for houses and so forth. These little orange things are some of the ash pits and fire pits. And then what we get right here, which is pretty remarkable, is there, and there is a layer of earth about a foot thick that's really clean, has no artifacts in it, and it was laid down across this entire thing. They came in and capped this off with earth before they started to lay additional deposits, which we suggest are house mounds. So there's a house mound there, there's another one there, there's one there that's been cut right in the middle. So they're essentially building these things up like Middle Eastern tells, houses on tops of surfaces, surfaces that were cleaned and renewed, earth put on top of them, additional houses built on top of that. Again, this is all going on simultaneously, so we're looking at the possibility of having quite a few score of houses here and quite a few people, so maybe upwards of a few hundred people. This year, for the first time, we've been digging in these escarpments. There's an escarpment right there. This year, for the first time, we decided, let's open up the basement and do a block excavation, something about half the size of this space right here. And the students were opening up these 2x2 meter units and leaving these walls in place so we could follow the stratigraphy. And what you're seeing is the last of the shell, or I should say the very first of the shell, that was left behind by the miners and sitting on the original ground surface. So that dates about 6,000 years ago right there. And when the kids got to the bottom here, we expected nothing but clean sand, the original ground surface, nothing before that. And what's fun about archaeology is that usually we're wrong, right? And so it's always good that you find surprises. Because if you found what you thought you were going to find every time, at some point you'd have to stop and just say, we don't need to dig anymore. But lo and behold, I don't know if you can see that very well, but underneath the shell, in most places, were these massive pits. Some of them were as much as 8 feet wide, about 4 feet deep. This one's about a medium-sized one there. Can you guys see the outline of that? It's emanating from the surface. Here's another one right here. It's emanating from the surface. Sometimes they're just filled with dark earth. They have a lot of ash and charcoal and bone in them. Not a lot of artifacts, an occasional shell tool, an occasional stone tool. And then sometimes they have really elaborate fill, like this one here, where we can clearly see that there was a thermal use of this thing. It has oxidized burnt sand at the bottom, some organic sand associated with that as well, and then some just general midden fill, but then we get a layer of apple snail, which is the much larger aquatic snail that we know that people were eating those things for sure. It's your good, you can get a good piece of protein out of that. So we get these pits that look like they were filled with different activities or the refuse of different activities, and in some cases, perhaps even filled deliberately to achieve certain results here. Much like our shell mounds, they have the same sort of layers in them. Now, not all of these ridges, I'm going to take an excursion for just 2 slides, I promise. Not all of these ridges were habitation places. So the very first one we worked on, which is at the south end of Hontoon Island, is the oldest in Florida that we know of, and it's the best one for being fully preserved. It's fully intact. So if you've been to Hontoon Island, you take the nature trail all the way to the south end, you're going to end up right here. There's the end of the trail. And you'll be standing about, 15 or 20 feet above the swamp on the oldest shell mound in Florida. It dates to 7,000 years ago. Now, unlike the one I just showed you, this one has a sequence which is much different. We don't see the layers of earth. We don't see the house floors. We don't see accumulations of artifacts. We don't find food remains aside from the shell. We don't get a lot of charcoal. We don't get the paleofeces. We don't get evidence of living. What we have is evidence of construction that was very deliberate. So at the bottom of this thing is a midden that dates to 7,000 years ago. But on top of that, a massive cap of shell with no internal differentiation other than these micro layers in here. Some burning perhaps, it's hard to say. But no earth, no artifacts, no food remains. Just a massive cap of clean shell. We debate this all the time. I have colleagues that say, Ken, that's not a cap. That's just what happens when shell is exposed for thousands of years and rain percolates down through it and critters dig in it and tree roots come in and out and so forth. That'd be fine if it happened over a long period of time. This all went up in less than 50 to 100 years. So it may have happened in a weekend, for all I know. On top of that is these alternating layers of light and dark, light and dark, light and dark, light and dark, at least 18 of them. Those also occurred in a relatively short period of time, within 50 to 100 years. So unlike what we've seen to this point, and I can't really explain this 100%, but what I think we're looking at here is commemorative, monumental practice. This is ritual practice. They're coming back to a place that they originally resided at that is no longer inhabitable. Why is it no longer inhabitable? The river channel that ran adjacent to this thing underwent a switch during a flood stage and went to the west and abandoned this site as a place of water. And it started to infill with peat, started to infill with muck, and today it's even dry during most of the year. So it became cut off from the river system. It was no longer a viable place to live. They went back there, despite that, they went back there repeatedly and loaded up shell on top of it until they achieved this monument. They're living nearby, but they're using this as a place for gathering, and I think ultimately what this means in terms of practicality is that this is how you basically keep your community together. You get them together for these annual or semi-annual or even at a greater periodicity events where everybody comes together. It's historical. You talk about the good old days when you were there. You're probably arranging for marriages at that time, doing some horse trading and so forth. So these end up being like public facilities where people can come together and reconstitute their community. And this would be especially important at a time when people are moving around a lot. How do you keep everyone together if they can't stay put for very long? Okay, so I'll leave that one behind and get back to this one, and we'll quickly recap here what we have. We have these 6,000 to 7,000-year-old ridges of the Mount Taylor period. Those are both, we don't know about this one. This one's completely gone. It's on Forest Service land. We haven't excavated there. We're pretty confident that both of these are residences. Unlike the one I just told you about, what this has that one did not have is the permanence of the spring, the permanence of the spring run. So as a first magnitude spring, it's less vulnerable to fluctuations in rainfall and fluctuations in groundwater than would be, say, the St. Johns River itself. This is being fed by that deep aquifer. As long as there's regional precipitation, this thing's being recharged on a regular basis. So it's a much more reliable source, and we're probably seeing continuity of settlement because of that. Now, in addition to this, I haven't talked about mortuary treatment yet, but we're pretty sure, we know for sure here, and we suspect here, that the people living here at this time had two cemeteries, one to the southwest, one slightly to the northeast. These, by the way, there's alignments here I could tell you about at another time. I think there's all sorts of solstice alignments between the cemeteries and the villages and so forth. But in any event, we know we have bodies that were interred here 6,000 years ago. We only know about one right here, and we haven't dated it. We're not going to be able to, but we suspect that dates to that time period as well. But let's move forward to this guy, which was constructed later on top of and expanded out from an existing deposit dating to 6,000 years ago. This one dates to about 4,000 years ago. It's obviously the biggest monstrosity out there, the most conspicuous thing. And Jeffries Wyman, when he was there in 1872, described it as the largest shellworks in all of northeast Florida. He hadn't seen Turtle Mound yet, but it's pretty big. Jeffries Wyman was the first curator of the Peabody Museum of Harvard University. He named Viviparus georgianus. He named a lot of things. He was a naturalist. He was an antiquarian too, and he was a proponent of the idea that shell deposits were human, not natural, right? He was the guy that kind of put that on the archaeological map. This is his sketch from an unpublished notebook. Asa Randall went up to Harvard University at the med school, found this illustration. We know his description, so we have a good idea what this thing looked like. We don't have a decent scale here. Asa's just guesstimating. He's also estimating the orientation of this thing. But at least we have this touchstone of historical observation that Jeffries Wyman left behind. And it gives us some opportunity to target our investigation so that we can see what's left of it. Again, it was mined in 1923, part of the $17,000 of work that was done there. Now, we have one other bit of evidence that's been collected over the years by various people, a lot of artifact collectors and so forth, and that is just a lot of pottery at the north end of this thing, right here. So where this thing is situated now is based on Wyman's observation and our archaeological work, but it's long since gone. And what we have in this area now are these little islands and, of course, the shoreline that was left behind by the looting operation. And along the shoreline and in these islands left behind by the mining, just tons of this pottery. This is the orange fiber-tempered pottery. It's typically decorated. It's highly elaborate, and it appears out of nowhere. It wasn't there before. There isn't a slow, gradual buildup. It just kind of comes in really abruptly, and there's lots of it, just incredible amounts of it. I have a graduate student, Zach Gilmore. He's doing chemical assays on these things to figure out the source of the clay. He's also doing thin sectioning to look at the different recipes that potters were using to see if he can find if there were different social groups that were participating in the use of these things and their deposition on the mound. But we have a lot of this. The difficulty is finding out what's left of the monument itself, of the shellworks. So we do typical excavations. Here we are at the South Ridge, and we do have the shell right on the original ground surface. All this has been truncated, so they're standing on a ground surface now that before 1923 was probably up about here, at least about 12 feet higher, right? Kevin was on this excavation in 2010, right, at the field school. He excavated some of these nice squares. Thank you, Kevin. Aren't they beautiful? Yeah, they're very nicely done. I'm a real stickler for straight walls and clean profiles and all that, so Kevin did great work. The whole crew out there did excellent work, but we were very frustrated. We couldn't find definitive evidence of houses. We were looking for features. We figured, there must be a large community here. Where are these people living? What are they doing here besides piling up all this shell into this massive U-shaped monument? So we get Rich Estabrook out there from FPAN. He's now points further west. He left a little while ago with his nice GPR machine, ground penetrating radar. And we dragged the GPR machine across this beautiful golf course-like lawn of the hunting club to find evidence for subterranean evidence for houses and other associated facilities. Well, this is what we found. All the red and yellow is showing you places where there's concentrations of shell below the surface that's relatively thick and dense. And as you can see, ignoring some of this noise over here, you could draw a line and call it an arc and say that there's something that might suggest a village that's in a circle or a semicircle. And we know from the coast that's the way they're living at this time. So what we got to do in the future, of course, is go and excavate more and find out what exactly is represented by this. But I do have the idea that we're looking at household clusters, that there's one here, maybe one here, a bigger one here. Not sure what's going on over here. But ultimately, we have to fill this in with the rest of the GPR, see what we got. I'm trying to convince Kevin to come back and do it. Maybe he'll do it for his graduate research. We'll see. And there it is, to put it into perspective. That's how much we've covered when we got this much more to do. Now, of course, all this is gone. This is all wetland. You can see that. The miners that came in here were authorized to take away the shell. And this is where they started. And about 3 months into it, one of the club members came to visit, and he saw that they were digging below grade, and the water was encroaching on the land. And he said, "Oh, stop." Well, they got into a big legal dispute. It went to court. They sued them. They went back and forth and so forth. They eventually got some compensation for this, but they got a little too aggressive. Right? They were supposed to basically just take the shell and leave us intact. So this has all been compromised. It's all wetland now. This is all gone. So all we have left is basically that remnant there and this portion right here where we did this GPR work. And right now, all we can say is that we think basically we have some households here. We don't know if they're arranged in a circle or not. And we, of course, haven't dated any of those. We haven't gotten anything decent to date. Certainly no direct evidence yet. However, there's another site that lends a different twist on this story just to the west. And it's a very unassuming site. It's one of those sites where you walk up and just go, looks like a great place to live, but I don't see anything. No mounds there. There's no above-ground architecture or anything. It's just these little nodes. We call it Locust Be, and there's another one here, Locust C. So A was the one I showed you, the linear ridge, which is over here. The big U-shaped thing's over here. Here was that linear ridge that dated to 6,000. And then a little bit further to the west, we got these two little nodes. There's one right there, and there's one right here. And there's also a village here we'll talk about briefly at the very end in a few minutes. And we also have the sand mound, which dates to the later period. It has nothing to do with these two nodes right here. So Zach Gilmore, my grad student who's worked out there for 4 years, he's finished now. He's writing up his dissertation. He launched investigations at Locust Be, and we were expecting to find a village. If they're not living at the big U-shaped monument, they must be living at Locust B and Locust C. That must be their village. We expected to find house floors, post holes, fire pits, refuse dumps, and things like that. Instead, what we found was pretty remarkable and surprising. Again, another surprise. We found these massive pits like we saw at the 6,000-year-old mound, but now they're 4,000-year-old, and they have pottery in them. They have pottery that's plain, no decoration, except for this layer of shell on top, which has pottery that's decorated with the curvilinear punctated style, the very rare form. So we have a change here. There is hundreds of these pits. They're everywhere. They intercept one another. They clearly dug a lot, and they processed a lot of food there. We think these are steaming pits. They have burning at the bottom, but the shell that was being processed in it is not the snail, it's clam. It's freshwater clam. So the freshwater clam, the mussels that they're eating out of the spring run and out of the lake are being processed here. Where are they consuming them? If they're not living here, perhaps they're taking them to the U-shaped monument where people are gathering with all these pots. They're having large social gatherings, a lot of feasting, a lot of consumption. So this is essentially a big food station, processing station with all these pits. The story doesn't end there, though, because the pits are filled in after they're used, often with these very intricate layers of shell, earth, clay, charcoal, and occasionally bone. And sometimes it just looks random, and other times it looks like they were very carefully putting things in these pits to achieve a certain outcome. I'll let Zach tell a story someday when he comes here, perhaps to give a talk about what he thinks it means. But we've got to the point where we really think that what's going on in this landscape is a lot of ritual practices involving the deposition of shell and other substances. That they were using these media, shell, ash, earth, bone, to basically write their histories, or to perform their histories rather than write them. It was their medium of historical practice. So to wrap it up for this, here's what we're left with. There's Locust Be, where we just got all those big pits. We got our 4 early sites dating from 7,000 to about 5,000 years ago. These are really 6,000. These might be a little earlier. And that's those big ridges that have a lot of evidence for living. Then we have, okay, that's the artifacts associated with it. Then we have on this ridge here, 2 ridges, a north ridge and a south ridge, that have very distinctive artifact assemblages. The north ridge has all the incised pottery. The south ridge has nothing but the plain pottery. Locust Be over here, the big pits, has the plain pottery in the pits that's identical to this. Zach has done the chemical analysis. This stuff is identical. The radiocarbon ages are exactly the same. It's all perfect. And then it's got this really unusual punctated pottery with round incisions or circular incisions, which is different than this. And this is not chemically similar to this, so it's a different group. So we got 3 different groups here. We got the guys that are doing this. We got these people, presumably from the coast, and we have these people whose origins remain to be determined, but one possibility is the Gulf Coast rather than the Atlantic coast. So possibly Atlantic, St. John's, Gulf, all converging in this one place about 4,000 years ago. It's Woodstock. Or it's Burning Man, if you know what Burning Man is out in the desert, right? All right. Well, this is the coastal living at the time, so there's no surprise here that we have, when you look at coastal shell rings, we have some forms here like Bonito Bay, Horse Island, look a lot like the U-shaped thing at Silver Glen. Silver Glen is one of 4 on the freshwater of the St. John's. These are all saltwater, but they have cousins, saltwater cousins or coastal cousins, that probably explain the origin of these things. And certainly the time frame's right, and the pottery is used in both of these places. Okay, 2 more minutes or so, and I'll wrap it up. I just wanted to shift gears here. We're pretty much finished working on the shell deposits for a while, and I have a new grad student, Elise Anderson, who's interested in late period archaeology, the Timucua, before the Europeans showed up, on the eve of European contact. And Silver Glen, actually, right at the spring boil, has a very sizable St. John's II period village, which would be ancestral Timucuan. The freshwater Timucuan, I think they call them, right? So we knew this because when we were doing survey along the spring run back in 2007, we came into this really thick midden. It's about 4 to 5 feet thick, that was just chock full of a lot of the check stamp pottery, which is common after about AD 750. We got radiocarbon dates from pits at the site that date to about the 12th, 13th through 14th century. So before European contact, well after the time the shell was accumulating at these other things. And we have a lot of features here. So our plan here basically is to open up large excavations so that we can find the houses, reconstruct the village. We suspect the village actually there's the spring boils down here. There's the spring run. This is a topographic map, and all these dots show where we did a little shovel test. If they're blue or red, they had shell in them, and then the ones here that are empty in the middle is presumably a plaza for a little village that might have had 18 to 20 houses with an open public space in the middle. That's the hypothesis. It's Elise's job as an archaeology student to try to substantiate that with excavations. She's also very much into animism, so she's interested in the religion of these people, and she understands because of their religious practices that, and we have Spanish documents to support this, that they would have regarded the animal and plant kingdom as being populated by spirits that are not much different than human. So everything's animated. You know, so you treat animals and you treat plants the way you treat other humans. They had reciprocal relationships, certain practices for deposition. For instance, the deer had to go in certain places and the fish had to go in other places. And where does she get all this from? She actually worked with the Maya, the living Maya, the ethnographic Maya, and worked with the Maya hunters who basically occasionally take all the deer bone from their kills back to a cave and put it back into the cave, and their belief system is such that by putting the bones back into the cave, they repopulated the deer population. We know Northwest Coast people do this with salmon. They put some of the salmon back in the water in order to repopulate the population. Here we're talking about, you know, ritual spiritual beliefs, not the physical reality of regenerating these animals by putting them back in the water. They are animated that way. So a lot of pit features, and what Elise is going to do is excavate a lot of these, look at the content, compare the content from different households, north, south, east, west, look for these patterns that she suspects are there. We're having a hard time finding architecture, but there's a big post hole from maybe a public building. It's quite large, and there's a smaller pit right adjacent to it. And then finally, the last thing, which was a shock, was that we went to the center of the plaza where we didn't expect to find houses, but we found when we dug a shovel test some ash. And we thought maybe we had like a sacred fire in the middle. But it turned out not to be a fire. It turned out to be an ash pit that's about, about a third of the size of this room. So pretty much where you guys are. It's about the size of you, right? Right out here. And it goes down about this far, and it's filled with nothing but ash and unburned snail shell. So there's no evidence of burning in place. There's no oxidation of the sand. This was a deposit where ash was brought from fires elsewhere, mixed with shell consistently, and then placed in the ground. There's nothing practical about this. Now, I really can speculate till the cows come home about what this means. I don't have any hard evidence, but clearly this is beyond the ordinary or the practical. There's something else going on here that we'll have to figure out. Unfortunately for Elise, it ended up dating to the late Archaic period, about the time when that U-shaped construction was abandoned. So we're not sure how this relates to what she's looking at, but it's right in the middle of the plaza. So I'll leave it with this photograph here. I think Kevin's in there somewhere. Where are you at, Kevin? Is that you? Yeah, there's Kevin. Huh? You can pick him out from the head? From the reflection? Kevin was one of our greatest archaeology students ever at field school. I'm missing 2012, but I have a question mark here because the Juniper Club, our host, when we first started, I didn't know that they would want us to be there. They're very private. It's a private club. They don't like publicity. They like keeping a low profile. So when I first went there, they invited me to give a talk. And when I first went there, I sheepishly said, you guys got some really cool archaeology here. Is anybody doing anything with it? They're like, no, we don't want anything. We don't want anything done with it. Hey, leave us alone. And one club member actually was interested, so he asked me to write a proposal. And I wrote him a small proposal, and I sent it to him. And that first year, they said, okay, but we're going to be keeping an eye on you guys and make sure that you're on your P's and Q's and so forth. Well, I run my field schools like a commandant, don't I? Yeah. No drinking, no fooling around. Sorry, if you want to come to my field school, there'd be no fooling around. But they were so happy with the results the first time, and then the second year and the third year, that now they say, we want you to come forever, right? So there's plenty of work to do, but I don't know if we'll be there forever. But what's great is that the field schools are designed for my grad students to implement their research. And then we, of course, take undergraduates to train them technically in the practice of archaeology. So it all works together. The grad students get their research projects. Undergrads get some technical training. The Juniper Club gets knowledge about the past of the land. And for the greater good of Florida, it's good archaeological practice that we document what's left of these sites. They were written off. There were people that wrote these sites off, but they're clearly still valuable. There's still a lot left of them. And I hope you get a sense from this talk today that it's worth the effort to look into them. There's still much to be learned. Florida archaeology is fascinating. It's one of the greatest archaeological regions in the world. But I'm afraid that it's underappreciated because it's been glossed. It's been overgeneralized. There's a lot more interesting things going on if you peel back the layers and ask different questions. And I hope that you got a sense of that from my talk today. So thanks for listening.
Okay, we have time for a few questions.
Yes, sir. Yeah, for the sake of the recording, I'm asked to repeat. So the question is, do we ever find whole pots, essentially? The short answer to that question is no, and I'm sorry that we don't, because it would help us to verify our reconstructions are accurate. But we do reconstruct vessels. The trouble is with fiber tempered pottery, and I can't explain this. I've been working with fiber tempered pottery since the early 90s in the Savannah River Valley, Georgia, South Carolina, and now in Florida. The people that made and used that stuff had a penchant for taking broken pots and distributing the pieces widely. So we don't get what archaeologists call pot busts, which is that if I'm carrying a pot filled with water and I drop it, that I might just walk away from it and then an archaeologist finds it 5,000, 4,000 years later. That would be nice. But I think what they did was I think they literally picked up their stuff and discarded it in different places. Like, it may have very well been a lot of it went into water. But it could have very well been that pieces from a broken pot, because they had certain beliefs about pots, had to be distributed to different people, right? And they took it off to different places. I've had pot sherds fit together from 500 meters apart. And I don't think that's because, a squirrel or something carried it over there. So, no, we never do. The closest thing we ever did was this pet 2 summers ago. We came down on one that was fully intact and burned. But it was so badly burned that when we got out of the ground, it just turned into dust, pretty much. It just crumbled. Kind of sad. The students were very sad. Kevin, was that your year? It was a year after you. Yeah. Yeah. No, that was the one it was one Locust Sea. It was a year after you. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions, please. Yes, sir. That's a good question. How much competition would there have been for land? If we knew what the total population was, we could estimate what the capacity was of the land to sustain them. Archaeologists call it carrying capacity, right? We could take, if we knew there was 10,000 people, we could add up the amount of occupiable land and divide them up into that and figure that out. We don't know that. So do we see evidence for competition? I think that would manifest itself in ways that might include violent confrontation. So do we see burials with embedded projectile points? Occasionally, they've been found. That's true of all peoples and all times and places. I mean, whether we're talking about the Pueblo Indians in the Southwest or Midwestern farmers, the shell fishers of Kentucky and Tennessee, it's usually less than 5% that individuals have evidence for violent death. But then there's indirect evidence like perifractures. If you have a fracture here from warding off a blow, somebody's hitting you or something like that. It might be indicative of that too, but you could also get that from falling off, falling out of a tree and trying to catch yourself or something. So I don't know that we see that. I'd like to think that it was a little bit more peaceful and that people could figure out ways to get along. And I think sites like this are important for that. When you can get communities focused in on the same belief system, like any religion, right? It's a way of holding together people. They may have different walks of life, different beliefs about politics and about everyday living, but if they believe in the same supernatural forces and they abide by that, they have that in common. Crisis is what brings people together. We saw that after 9/11. We saw that after all the hurricanes we've been through as Floridians. Crisis brings people together. So I think in many cases these things were precipitated by dramatic environmental changes that rather than leading to competition, dog eat dog, it was more like we're all in this together. Let's figure out a way forward. Let me just say one more thing to end that. Is like, I'm on this kick now. It's a midlife crisis that started about 10 years ago. That I think archaeology has much more utility than ever before imagined for helping us look at our own futures. Because we have this long-term perspective. Now, granted, we're not Native Americans living off the land, but we still have to confront things like environmental change. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to work towards building better long-range planning by looking back further in time? That's why history is important, I think. It really is. Yes, ma'am.
What you talked about brings up a question I've been thinking about. I helped take out the material at Gaudier.
Oh, you did?
And
Not too far from here.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I was thinking the other day that I may have made an assumption that wasn't right because there were several skeletons that had projectile points, around the ribs and things like that. And then I thought to myself, well, maybe I was just, nobody ever told me anything. Maybe I was just assuming that they were actually injured by those things, or were they buried on top of them and then just fell?
Unless it's embedded in bone, you wouldn't know. If it was a soft tissue injury, if someone was shot in the gut, it never hit the spine, didn't hit a rib, it may still be there, and it may be, in fact, indirect evidence for violent death. But the fact of the matter is, I think we know with good certainty that objects like that were included in graves post-mortem. The individual's dead and put into the ground, and then there's grave goods associated with the individual. We just salvaged burials off the Gulf Coast this past weekend, and the only in-flesh burial was a late juvenile, a teenager, who had a projectile point right under the mandible. But it never even crossed my mind that was violence. That was an offering. That was a grave good. It was actually a big knife. So a lot of things, the other question you have to ask yourself when you do that is that, is what you're looking at a knife or a projectile? A lot of what people call projectile points or arrowheads and all that are actually knives. And it wasn't very big? About like that, maybe? Oh, okay. That's one of the clues, of course, is size. And symmetry is another one. When you get things that have like concavity on one side and convexity on the other, probably not terribly aerodynamic.
Except for a couple of them, they didn't have very much with them.
Yeah, that's true of archaic people in general. To find there's 1,400 burials from the Indian Knoll site in Kentucky. It's the largest archaic population ever excavated. It was done during the Depression, during the WPA years, and thereafter some. I think the total population, there's less than 24% that have anything, and out of those, there's only a few that have a lot of stuff, like shell beads and spear points and things like that. Yes, sir?
Did you find very many bones there at Glen Run? And is there any relationship between bones that may have been found there and windowing?
Human bone. We haven't.
Anywhere between?
We've never. We run into human bone almost every year, and it's just in the middens. They're not burials. And this is actually an interesting footnote to the story. Jeffries Wyman in the 1870s saw human bone everywhere he dug, but it was always just broken pieces of bone mixed in with the deer bone and the fish bone and the shell. So he concluded they were cannibals. He later recanted on that, but it was commonplace for 19th century antiquarians to see the bone in with the animal remains and just say, well, they must have eaten humans too, right? So he saw, but to answer your question, no, and we don't target that. As soon as we hit human bone, we stop. We call the state archaeologists. They always tell us the same thing, which is the law. Stop what you're doing, document it, backfill it, don't remove it, and move on to some other place. We don't have the authority to do that. I also don't have the morality for it.
So there's been no in-depth study between any bones at Windover versus any of your things?
No, but there are people that Windover, of course, is undergone the legalities of having access to it for science, as are Gaultier and other things. I mean, there's plenty of skeletal populations. So Miranda Almy at the University of Florida, she just defended her dissertation. She went and measured all the skulls of every population she could get her hands on, and to find out how much biological variation there is. And like the Windover population is comparable to other archaic populations, except for ones on the northern Gulf Coast that look more like later period people. They're more robust. They have more angular features and so forth. There's at least 2, if not 3, very distinctive biological populations in Florida over time. And I don't know if we can trace it all the way back to the Ice Age, but The presumption in North American archaeology, you guys probably know this, has always been people got here across the Bering Land Bridge, right? 12,000 or 14,000 years ago, and then they beget all Native American peoples except for Athabascans and Inuit. And they came later. Those groups came later. But we now know that entry into North America most likely came down the Pacific, all the way down to South America early on, and that populations like Clovis, the original Clovis people, were not the only founding population. There's at least two founding populations. And biologically, they're distinctive in the morphology of their build, but genetically, they're going to have differences too. If we had access to all the skeletal material in the world, and we could run DNA and all sorts of other studies on them, we could reconstruct these histories pretty clearly. But the politics of dealing with barrels is tough. And we abide by the law, of course, always. We have to. Yes, sir. They're digging so many pits. You know, like the pits that I showed you there, they're literally just side by side by side pits everywhere over an area the size of this building. Zach estimates over 600 and some pits were dug, big ones. Some are big enough to drive a Volkswagen into. So if you buried someone there 6,000 years ago and 4,000 years ago, you come and start digging pits all over the place, they're intercepting them. I don't know that they always had the same sensibility that I might have, which is basically, whoa, you know, back off, as opposed to just throwing it over their shoulder and just keep doing what they're doing. So, you know, it's hard to read the minds of these folks, but, you know, I think we get a pretty good sense that they were very historical themselves, that they pondered their past, that they had practices that reflected those beliefs, and that sometimes they actually disinterred people and reburied them. We have evidence for that too. We call them bundle burials, where it's the skull, the long bones, but not the spine, not the shoulder bones, not the toe, not the fingers. But they've been reburied, so they obviously had some respect for that, to do that. Yeah. Anything else?
Dr. Sassaman will stay after if anyone else wants to come up and ask questions. Remember, next month, April 19th, it will be our last lecture of the season, so come out because we always have kind of an end of a series party. And so pick up a schedule if you don't have it. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. See you next year.